We were never meant to have access to this many carbohydrates. When I started carnivore or animal based, I instantly felt better. Instantly. I was sick and tired of eating and just being instantly bloated. Like, oh, this is just. People often tell me that the results I got were because I cut out processed food, which was not the case. I did 90 days of the Whole30 diet, which is whole foods, right? No processed foods, no prepackaged foods, cooked my own meals, ate lots of veggies, lean meats, fruits, and I lost weight, but nothing else improved. I decided to try strict carnivore, and instantly I feel good. I have good energy. My digestion's good. I don't have bloating. I lost weight. I have the ability to work out, all this stuff. Like, we were never meant to consistently get all of our energy from carbs. And so when you continually inundate yourself with these insulin spikes, and then you take the fact that our carbohydrate sources are so much higher in fructose than they were before, they have so much less fiber. Fiber's good when you're eating carbohydrates. Like, they should be together. You remove the fiber, you add this processed sugar, which is just pure sugar, with high levels of fructose, and you're going to get these metabolic issues.
Hey everyone, I've got something exciting to share. I'm heading to Meatstock 2025 and I'd love for you to join me. This is going to be an intimate carnivore convention set right up in the beautiful Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. You'll get to hang out with me and learn from some of the best voices in the carnivore world. Get your tickets now before they sell out, and don't forget to use code TheCarnitarian for $25 off. I'll see you all in the Smokies. Hey, you guys. So today we have Jason Brown, aka Carnivore JT, on the channel. He is known for his amazing results on the carnivore diet and his incredible calorie experiments. We dove into his latest overeating experiment and whether or not calories really matter on a carnivore diet. Plus, we discussed the limits of the whole concept of calories, along with how genetics and fuel partitioning and muscle mass all impact individual outcomes on carnivore. I think you guys are going to have some pretty strong feelings about this one. So let's get into it. Okay, so Jason, thank you so much for joining me on the channel. I have been dying to have this conversation. I have told you offline many times, I need to have like a 2-hour conversation with you. We'll try and keep it short, but I'm absolutely blown away by the experiments that you've been doing, and we're going to get into that. So I just want to say thank you. I appreciate you taking the time. I know that it is like your mission to empower people to sort of gain back their health, their vitality, and you, like I, think that the best way to do this is through a carnivore way of eating. So why don't we just give you some time? Why don't you give us a little bit of background about you, how you came to a carnivore diet, how long you've been doing it, and your feelings about carnivore in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm one of the few people that came to carnivore not out of necessity, which makes my experience and my viewpoints a little bit different. So I kind of landed on carnivore because, so I started animal based. And I landed on it because my old tricks were working for weight loss, but they didn't work to make me feel better. Right. And so the majority of mine was low energy, brain fog, the afternoon crash, and bloating. Right. I was tired of bloating. I was sick and tired of eating and just being instantly bloated. And I'm like, oh, this is lame. Didn't matter what I eat. And people often will tell me, people like to infer what my experience has been. And they'll often tell me that the results I got were because I cut out processed food, which was not the case. I did 90 days of the Whole30 diet, which is whole foods, right? No processed foods, no prepackaged foods, cooked my own meals, ate lots of veggies, lean meats, fruits, the likes. And I lost weight, but nothing else improved. Nothing regarding my life improved. And so when I started carnivore or animal based, I instantly felt better. Instantly. I was like, okay, there's something to be said for this. And then I gradually got to the point where I was like, well, I feel super good. That's the other thing, right? I had really good success animal based. I'm a big proponent of animal based. I decided to try strict carnivore. I was like, what if there's better? Like, I don't know. I feel good. I have good energy. My digestion's good. I don't have bloating. I lost weight. I have the ability to work out, all this stuff. But I was like, man, there's still this aspect, and a lot of people can relate, especially athletes or former athletes, where I have to have my food planned, right? I can't go longer than 3 or 4 hours without eating, or I start to get that like shaky, right? Like I feel like my
Mm.
blood sugar's low, like I need to eat. And I was like, that kind of sucks. Like, I don't like that. And so I'm like, man, I wonder what happens if I just go full carnivore and really go after the fat adaptation. And that was of everything that I've been able to experience, that is the biggest benefit to me on carnivore right now, is my ability to be adapt, adapted. And
Hmm.
then I can go hours without eating and I don't have to worry about it. If I have morning appointments and like I use the situation with my tattoo, like my sleeve, and the guy's like, yeah, plan for 7 to 8 hours. Bring some food. And my first thought is, what am I gonna do? Like instantly. And then I realized I was like, I don't have to worry about it, right? Because in the back of my mind, there's nothing worse than getting this shaky, like I have this low blood sugar while I'm putting my body through this hyper adrenaline, phase of getting tattooed. And then I was like, wait a minute, I don't have to worry about it. And so I literally ate. I had an appointment before, so I ate, and then 10 hours later came home and ate again and was totally fine. And that right there is the reason I will stay carnivore. I tell people I'm probably the most like carb lenient carnivore out there. Like I have no problem with carbs. I don't think carbs are necessarily the problem. But man, me being able to be adapted is the biggest game changer for me.
It's great. I mean, it's that unending sort of supply of energy. You don't get the bonk. If you're like an athlete, you're running, you don't get the bonk. I dance, I don't get the bonk, and it's incredible how much energy we all have on us that we can tap into when we're not trying to burn carbohydrates for energy. So, yeah, that's awesome. That's really great. So, how long has it been for you that you've been carnivore? Is it 2 years?
So 2 years when I first started, kind of the animal based, and then it was November of last year that I went strict carnivore, and I've been pretty much strict ever since.
Now, in that time, you have done some tremendous N equals one experiments that have grabbed a lot of people's attention, for better or for worse. They've certainly got my attention. I know that in your past, you were a calorie deficit guy, right? You were the guy, correct me if I'm wrong, who was calculating total daily energy expenditure, taking out a percentage to create a reasonable deficit. And that is how weight loss happens. And you've done these experiments now with carnivore, with a standard diet, to sort of try to debunk this CICO myth, calories in, calories out, as the end all be all of losing weight, body recomposition. So, can you take us through? Why not take us through your latest experiment, and then we can compare that to your previous experiments? But this latest experiment absolutely blew my mind. So, why don't you go ahead and tell us what that was about?
Yeah, so I have been someone, and again, this gives me a different perspective because I use the CICO bro terminology because I was one, right? Like I was somebody who could, down to a science, manipulate my weight. And I've done it many times. And it was a combination of adjusting macros and adjusting calories and increasing my expenditure and all this stuff. And that's why I know it can work, right? But it's not 90% of people who are a proponent of it are fit, metabolically healthy people. And I came to realize that that is a huge part of it. But there's also this component that for myself and for any example they bring, like anybody who has to cut weight, whether it's for a sport, fighting sport, bodybuilding, whatever it is, they always eat clean, right? You don't see somebody, they do the calories, they do the macros, they manipulate, but they always eat clean. They eat chicken and rice, they eat oatmeal, you don't, they don't eat Rice Krispies for breakfast. They don't. Now there is something to be said for the if it fits your macros, but when they are really trying to dial in, they always eat clean. And so I had that in the back of my mind when I first started. The latest experiment, I was playing around. And see, this is the funny these experiments are for me, right? They're for my understanding. And I have come to realize that if it's something I'm curious about, it's something that my followers are curious about. Like that's typically why they follow me. And so I decided to document, and my hypothesis going in, and I don't often share my hypothesis because that's not the point. Like my point is just to do it, document it, and let people, take it how they will. But my hypothesis was that the fact that I was 10 pounds lighter than when I did my first experiment, that I would have less of a response to even to the same number of calories with the exact same amount of food, but that I still wouldn't gain weight. And so that was the whole thing, right? My hypothesis was my reaction to the amount of calories that I'm eating is dependent on where I currently am, right? Do I have excess fat? Am I relatively lean? What does my body composition look like? And that I didn't think I could get to the point where I could forcibly make myself eat enough to gain fat. And so, and this is the funny thing, and this is one of the things taken out of context. In the very beginning, I was like, I'm going to try to get to 5,000, but if I have to tap out early, I'm going to tap out early. I'm not like, people want me to be this robot. Like, I have a family, I have a life. If it's going to negatively affect it, I'm going to stop. I don't care. Right.
Right.
So I was like, I'm going to try. And I was going good. Like I was like, this time I'm gonna try and slowly get into it. Last time I just went from 0 to 100 in terms of how much I was eating. So I'm like, I'm gonna try to slowly get into it and see if I can establish a baseline on what a calories in, calories out person would do. Right? That's their goal, right? You calculate it out, you start, and then based on what's happening, then you adjust. So I lost a little bit of weight in the beginning, which I
Well, tell
expected.
us what your plan was. You were going to start at a certain amount of calories and then work
Yeah,
your
so
way up to.
I was gonna start at 3,000,
Okay.
which would, if you would ask me what my maintenance is, that's what I would tell you. That's what my total daily energy expenditure calculations come out as. 3,000 is my maintenance. And so I was like, I'm going to do 500 calorie increments every 2 weeks. So for 2 weeks,
All
I did
carnivore.
all carnivore. So for 2 weeks, I did 3,000 calories. For 2 weeks, then I did 3,500 calories. Then I did 2 weeks of 4,000 calories, 2 weeks of 4,500. And then the goal was to get to 5,000. And everything was pretty easy. Like it wasn't that difficult. I hit a point a week into my 4,500 calories where I was eating my food, and I can estimate my calories pretty well. But at this point, I just turned it off. I was like, I don't care. Like whatever. I'm gonna eat my food. I'll calculate it at the end.
Yeah.
And the way I was feeling, I was like, man, I think I went over. Like I think I went over my calories today. And after I calculated, I was at like 3,000, and
And you rang the bell.
I was like, are you kidding me? I was like, I am 1,500 calories short, and I do not want to eat anymore. And so I was like, well, maybe it's just a fluke. The next day, I was like, I'm just going to eat. I'm not going to kill myself. I'm just going to eat and see what happens. I ate like 2,000 calories. I was like, I'm done. I was like, I'm not going to try to make up, 4,000 calories over the next week and kill myself for it, because for myself, I have proved what I started, this whole process of trying to show.
So you had sort of just hit your saturation point. You were just full. You were feeling totally satisfied and just could not go on, could not increase the calories. But the result of overeating, the quote unquote overeating, more than your total daily energy expenditure should result in some weight gain. Some weight gain.
And
What was the result?
that's what I aimed to show, was that okay, I'm going to eat at my maintenance, right? Nothing should happen. I think I lost 2 pounds over the first 2 weeks. I was like, okay, that would, if we were doing this based on math, if this is really as simple as calories in, calories out, thermodynamics, I'm using the best available information that we have for an average person. The only thing that you could get more precise is if I went to a lab and had some direct calorimetry done, and that's just not, you can't ask a normal person to do that. You can't ask anybody to do that, really. So I was tracking my activity, I was tracking my sleep, I was tracking my intake, I had a body composition analyzer scale. I was doing all of these things. And so I lost weight. I'm like, okay, so if I'm losing weight at 3,000, first of all, that just can't be below my maintenance, right? Like I've done enough
Right.
in the past to know that that's not. And then I didn't gain any weight at 3,500. I'm like, okay, so if we're doing math, then 3,500 should be my maintenance. Except then I didn't gain weight at 4,000. I was actually like 0.2 pounds less after my 2 weeks of 4,000. And then at the end of a week of 4,500, I didn't gain any weight. I'm like, okay, so if we're doing math here and we're going based on my results and 3,500 is my maintenance, I should have gained 2 pounds at 4,000. I should have gained 2 pounds at 4,500. And it was the exact same at the end of 4,500 as I was at the end of 3,500. So I'm like, okay, like that tells me I have 1,000 calorie play, which should result in a couple pound, 2 pounds a week of fat gain that my body's like, yeah, we'll take care of it. You're good. Right. And so I'm like, that's literally all I need to know. All I need to know is that I don't have to track down to the last minute detail. And if I'm 200 calories off, I'm going to gain or lose weight. No, I have this wide range that my body goes, we'll take care of it. Now, if I sat there at 5,000 calories and I drank butter and, you know, I absolutely force myself to limit, yeah, absolutely. At some point, I think I will gain fat, right? But the goal wasn't for me to determine that. The goal was, can I get myself to that point without like completely overriding my system, right? Like, sure, I can override my way into gaining weight. I've gained weight before. I started this whole thing, 35 pounds heavier, but I was also eating junk. So I'm like, it, if you eat the appropriate foods and you are healthy, it gets difficult to get to that point.
Okay. So now this is where people lose their minds because they say, but JT, I'm carnivore. I hear this all the time. Let's give an example, a very typical example. I'm 5'4". I'm between 50 and 60 years old. I'm at 40% body fat. I'm carnivore and I've been carnivore for a while. Why can't I do what you do and see weight loss or see stability? When I switched to higher fat percentage, which is what, and I'm not speaking for me, I'm speaking for this abstract person. This person would say, when I went from standard carnivore to high fat carnivore, I gained weight. Now, how can that be explained if calories don't matter on carnivore? And I'll tell you, though this is not your message, this is what people are hearing you say, and that is driving people crazy. Is they are saying there's this guy out there that thinks that calories don't matter on carnivore, that you can eat as many calories as you want and you will maintain your weight or lose weight. And these people are losing their minds. So can you clarify for us the difference between you and, say, this example person or the general population, why this works for you and may not work for someone else?
So that's another one that people like to infer. I'm definitely not
Yeah.
of the opinion that calories don't matter. And I've even shared a couple video clips of Dr. Bickman, which I love his stuff, where he explicitly states, yes, calories matter. In order to gain weight, you have to have a combination of a hormonal response and an addition of excess calories. So it absolutely does play into that. My whole point and what I've tried to convey, and I get like part of it is this people need to come to their own conclusions. Part of it is this social media, world that we live in where you have to elicit some kind of response early on. And that's what hooks people, right? I'm not denying that. Also, there's the point that I just don't have the time or the platform to in-depth explain every single piece of every video that I do. Like you just can't. And so do I think calories matter? Yes. Do I think they are the end all be all? No. But I also think there's a huge genetic component that goes into it in how we utilize this energy that we have and how good your body is at maintaining homeostasis. And I think a huge part of that is your metabolic health. And I've tried to say that over and over and over again. You have to get yourself metabolically healthy first, right? You can't expect to be able to just do whatever you want if you're starting from a place of being metabolically unhealthy. And so, that's backed up by this idea of metabolic flexibility, right? My ability to go huge swings with minimal, right? Like I can drop down, and here's the caveat to it. I can drop down to 2,000 calories, and I did this prior to the first experiment, which is kind of why I started it. I can drop down to super low calories, and I will lose weight, but I don't lose it like it's going out of style, right? Like I was at about 2250 in the month, a couple months leading up to the first experiment, and I lost 6 pounds in 4 weeks, which is like that's par for the course. Like that's nothing crazy. Like that's a steady loss. And so then, how restricted that is. If there was no metabolic flexibility, I would have lost 20 pounds, right? Like being that restricted. And so I think that's the biggest one. Like you have to be able to have this metabolic health. You have to be insulin sensitive. I'm very, very insulin sensitive, right? I have perfect blood glucose levels and I have very low insulin levels. Low to the point that you honestly I actually had to. I'm pretty good friends with a naturopathic doctor who is a type 1 diabetic and has a diabetes clinic. And I sent him my first numbers because my insulin was so low. And the only time you can find any information on low insulin is when it's also paired with high blood glucose and then you're diabetic.
Right.
Right. And so I'm like, well, what if I don't have high blood glucose, but I also have low insulin? Can't find anything. Like, because I was off the chart low. And he's like, yeah, you're super insulin sensitive. You're totally fine.
Not type 1 diabetic,
No,
but just totally insulin sensitive. Yeah.
my insulin was 1.6 when I got it
It's very
tested.
low.
Very
Yeah.
low.
And the glucose
And
hangs out about where?
I'm usually low 80s, mid 80s. And then I've heard well, that's because you're not carb tolerant. And I was like, actually, I'm very carb tolerant. So I had my insulin and my glucose done before and after my SAT experiment, where if anybody didn't follow along, I ate 10,000 grams of carbs in 3 weeks, right? Like I went from 0 to 100 and my glucose went from 79 to 81 and my insulin went from 1.6 to 2.1, I think.
Wow.
And so I'm like, that's the definition of being like carb tolerant. Like,
Right. You're shuttling them away. They are not overloading your blood. You are not getting a huge insulin response. You're not going into diabetic shock.
yeah, exactly. Right.
Right.
So that's a huge piece of it. There's not a whole lot of people that I've seen with numbers like that. So that is a big thing of it. There's also genetic components to stuff. It's basically energy wasting, right? One of them is the amount of energy that you can excrete through urine and feces. And it's not something that's studied huge, but they showed ranges from, 1% of your intake up to 10%, which is a huge range. Then you have stuff like you alluded to it before the energy partitioning, where some are just more genetically predisposed to utilize the excess energy that they have. You can call that a raise in your metabolic rate. You can call that energy inefficient or metabolic inefficiency, which in this case is good because you're burning more calories doing the same thing that a normal people would. You have entropy of your system, you're losing calories, you're not efficient. So there's a whole bunch of components that go into this that I think a lot of them are through your genetics. Some people are just predisposed to storing fat. And so, yeah, I think it's all of this stuff together that allows me to do what it is I'm doing. And it's also muscle mass, right? That is the biggest ace up the sleeve. Your ability to get away with anything is muscle mass, right? So it's all of these factors. And my goal isn't to say, hey, I can do this stuff and you can't. My goal is to say, hey, there's more to the story. Like, I'm not going to respond. You can take two people, measure their basal metabolic rate, measure their activity, measure all of this stuff, feed them the exact same foods, and they're not going to have the same response.
That is the most important part of this whole thing to me, is that you as an N equal 1 versus anyone else as an N equal 1 of their own, it's always going to end up with a different outcome. And it's when you get hyper formulaic with calorie deficit, TDEE, everyone should expect the same results. That's when people get so angry because they start saying, no, that's not how it works. That's not how it worked for me. Or yes, that's absolutely how it works because it is how it worked for me. This fuel partitioning theory to me is just phenomenal, right? Because it takes the CICO, like the calories in, calories out, where people get this good sense of, I'm driven to eat because of my genetics or my physiology or my insulin resistance. And that's why I say can't control my hunger. And that's why I'm overweight. Sometimes that makes people feel good. But this fuel partitioning theory, I think, is making people feel even better, because what it's saying is that at the beginning of it all, you are, as you say, genetically sort of predisposed to either being very efficient at storing calories in the form of fat, or very efficient in either wasting those calories or utilizing those calories. And that empowers people to understand your physiology, the way you sort of came to be, that is driving the bus here, and like, to compare someone like you to everyone else, on the planet, is like to compare a finely tuned machine, a Porsche, to a Ford Escort. You have the same basic biology, and people will argue that, well, the biology is the same. We should all work the same. Calories are going to work identically in two different people. But, just because the Porsche has a steering wheel and a suspension and an engine, and you've got a steering wheel and a suspension and an engine, they perform completely differently. Even with the same fuel, they perform completely differently. And we've seen people, and in this fuel partitioning paper, they discuss animal models where the animals are underfed, but one mouse will still gain weight underfed in a paired feeding situation where they're eating exactly the same thing. One will gain and one will stay lean, or one will gain and one will lose weight. And it's, I think, comforting for people, but at the same time, very frustrating, because at the end of the day, people want to know, well, what's the solution? Now, when I got to the end of that fuel partitioning paper, basically the solution was what we already know. The best we can do is to keep our insulin low, right? And we can do this best on a fat-fueled kind of a diet. What else can people do to sort of get to the point where you are? I mean, what are your tips for people who are frustrated that they can't eat as much because they naturally store more?
Yeah, and that can be a difficult one. I also think people need to understand that while there's all basic physiology, we are not necessarily the same as when we were, evolved or created, or however you want to identify our origins, right? The example I use is, what's the diet of a panda bear? They eat bamboo like 20 hours a day, right? Panda bears are carnivore. They're a carnivorous animal. They adapted to their environment having an abundance of bamboo, but they don't actually digest it very well, which is why they have to eat 20 hours a day to get enough nutrients out of it. So you view them as like, well, they're an herbivore. I'm like, no, they eat an herbivore diet, but they're actually a carnivore animal. Like that, their biology is carnivore. And so you're like, well, we have this ability to adapt, which is why you can be healthy by all intents and purposes on a vegetarian diet, on a vegan diet, on a carnivore diet, you can have healthy people who eat junk all the time. Like, we have this crazy ability to adapt. And so I think people need to get out of this idea that, well, I'm just going to do what this person does because it works for them. And that can be a good thing to experiment with, but it's also everybody who does that, it's years and years of knowing how your body reacts, right? Like, I can tell you what's going to happen based on foods I eat because I've done it for years. And so that's a lot of the people's frustrations, is they're taking, my experiments, my ability to self manipulate my intakes and the types of food, and knowing what's going to happen, and they want to do that with themselves without ever knowing all of, how it works with them. And part of it is paying attention to what you're eating. And I do think there's something to be said for, a lot of people don't know what exactly they're eating. They might tell you they know, but they don't really, right? Like, I think one of the ones is people do underestimate the amount of fat that they're getting because they don't take into account the fat that they're losing when they cook. And so they're like, I'm eating really high fat. I'm like, well, you're starting really high fat, but how much are you actually getting in? And so like that's a tough one, right? It's tough to say, well, you're not succeeding because you're doing it wrong, which that can be a little disingenuous, right? So I don't want to tell somebody that, but you also have to look at what you've been doing prior. And a lot of these people have been restricting themselves for so long that honestly, the first thing I do when I work with people, I'm like, you got to eat more, like eat more. And they're like, I can't do that. I'm like, okay, well, where do you have to go? Right. Yes, you can lose weight restricting yourself. There's a reason if you starve yourself, you will eventually die, right? You're not going to get fat by not eating anything, but eventually there's a limit, right? So you can't just keep decreasing. So you have to figure something out. And I think part of it is people just don't eat enough. And so they go through years and years of eating these low amounts of food, getting actually less food than they think, and you end up with people love to coin it starvation mode, which is ironic because the definition of starvation mode is literally just your body down regulating its metabolism to match its intake, which has nothing to do with starving yourself. But
It's like
so
homeostasis.
yeah, I don't use the term. It's literally just a metabolic adaptation, and that's like that is science. Is that your body will start to reduce the number of processes, the reduce the number of things that it goes through in order to limit its intake in a perceived, not deficit, but a perceived scarcity.
Shortage.
Yeah, starvation. Like, hey, we might starve here. Let's conserve. That's literally all starvation mode is. And you do that for enough years, and now, I don't want to say this. And again, people use these buzzwords like, well, I've wrecked my metabolism. It's not necessarily that you've wrecked your metabolism. You've just convinced your body to adapt to it. And now you have things like NEAT, your non-exercise activity, which is just like little stuff. I use my hands a lot. Like I burn a decent amount of calories just doing this stuff. In all these periods of super low intake, your body's going to shut down a lot of that, right? Your body's going to just start down regulating these processes. So part of it is people got to figure out how to get this back. And that can be scary because you can start gaining weight with it. Some people call it priming. I don't like priming per se because there can be problems. Priming is where you basically just tell people to eat as much as you possibly can. And if you gain any fat, that's totally fine. I like to use it kind of a reverse dieting where, hey, we're going to start low, or we're going to start where you're at, and we're just going to add calories. Yes, we're going to track, we're not going to do this for forever, but we have to start getting your body working for yourself. And then you start what I was doing, gradually trying to increase your calories to A, see how your body reacts, and B, to see if I can get to myself where I'm eating a decent enough amount of food. And then you can start to manipulate intake. But there's so many components to get to it. And I get asked this all the time. Hey, I'm 5'11", 185 pounds. How much should I be eating? I don't know. Like, I have no idea. And so I think it's a combination of that. People just need to try to eat more, and then they need to work out. Like you have to just go lift weights. Like the number of things, it's literally your fail safe, right? Like it's your fail safe against injury. It's your fail safe against bone density issues. It's your fail safe against, metabolic disorders. Like it's just, there's so many things that are improved by working out and strength training and building muscle that the combination of those two things, I think, help people the most. It's just tough for people to get started, and it's really hard for people who have this ingrained into their head that I need to eat less in order to lose weight, and now somebody's telling me that I need to eat more, and they're terrified. Like I've met people that
Right.
gives them anxiety. I'm like, well, that's part of the problem. Like you're not helping yourself with these levels of stress over your food, but you also can't just run off the rails and be like, I can eat whatever I want, however much I want. Well, you're trying to deal with 20, 30, 15 years of this damage that you've done to yourself.
Right.
So it's tough. It is really tough. But people have to understand that they're all in different situations. And a lot of it has to do with A, some of their genetics, and B, the path that you've been on the last 10, 15 years.
Right. And I think people sort of expect there to be a timeline that you could tell them as well. Say I'm in my 30s or I'm in my 40s and I've been metabolically unwell for, the last 20 years. Not apparently so because it didn't catch up with me until, they say, oh, well, it'll catch up with you. But But that damage is being done all the while. And then when they're in, say, their mid 40s, they're like, well, how long is this going to take to fix? It's another thing you just can't tell people. And it's not a guarantee that everything is, in fact, fixable, even with carnivore. And so there's this point of disappointment and frustration. But you're right that the anxiety of worrying about it can sometimes be very counterproductive to moving forward and gaining back health and, getting back a body composition that you were hoping for. It's frustrating, especially in the perimenopausal, menopausal population, because we have seen, and, studies are now showing that even with calorie deficit, the best body composition researchers out there see that their clients won't respond to a calorie deficit. There's obviously something more going on than just that they're eating too many calories. I think that we've got a problem in that we use the term calories for everything. And I know you hate it. This is the word we love to hate, is calories, because I wonder, what else do we have to work with? If we can't say to somebody, your food intake should consist of this many units of something, what do we have? What other term is there to use? We could talk about fat, we could talk about protein, we could talk about carbohydrate, but they all translate back to calories. So when somebody says, well, how much fat should I eat? What we're really talking about is how much energy we should take in. And then you're back to calories. And this is a point of like, well, can we do better than that? And I think that we just don't yet have a unit to try to guide people to the best food intake, that they're hoping for. And I don't know how we got so off the rails that, calories became the standard, but I give my clients, calorie breakdown, macro breakdown. I try to explain, to women, especially with lipedema, to moderate fat intake because it shuttles directly into storage and won't come out. And so we do have to be very careful with fat intake, which translates back to calorie intake. And it's a bit of like a frustration point in my mind, because I get that a calorie is not a calorie, like they say, and it has more to do with your metabolic health and getting your body to do with the energy what you want it to do than it has to do with, being a bomb calorimeter. It's like, we don't work that way. And so I hate to use calories, but what else do we have? We don't have anything else, right? So when you're guiding somebody, and like you say, you try to say, maybe you can't eat a stick of butter, maybe you can. It all translates back to calories. Like, what do you do? How do you refer to energy to people to get them to moderate when you know that what they're going to be eating is going to be too much for them and they'll end up storing?
So that's unfortunately the best we have, right? And that is my problem so much with calories in, calories out, is we are taking this as gospel when it doesn't even make sense from a physics standpoint, right? Like, it's thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is a property of physics, and it's in relation to heat energy. You don't eat heat energy, right? And people are like, I can do this song and dance all day, but you don't eat heat energy, right? Like, you eat carbon, right? You eat carbon molecules, you break down carbon molecules, you get energy out of the breaking of these bonds. And yes, is that probably the best one we have? Sure. But the problem is, and I equate this calories thing to gravity, right? Like, I loved physics. I took several, upper level physics classes in school that I didn't need to, just because I liked them. And physics is fascinating. But the problem with physics is most of what you learn in physics is how stuff relates in a vacuum,
In a
right?
closed system, yes.
Which is what calories is, right? Like, it was first designed around steam engines, and people are like, oh, no, it's still a thermodynamic law. Sure, you can't create or destroy energy. That doesn't tell you anything, right? First law of thermodynamics is specifically based around the exchange of heat in a closed system. The big thing that people always miss is the difference between a closed and an open system is there's no transfer of mass between systems in a closed system. It's literally just heat. Well, guess what? We transfer mass, right? We bring mass in, we get mass out. Now, if you were in a vacuum, If you were in a metabolic ward, could you get pretty close with manipulating weight gain and weight loss if you were hooked up 24/7, direct calorimetry, like all of this stuff? Probably, right? But that doesn't mean it's real world applicable, especially considering a calorie has nothing to do with our ability to metabolize it. There's calories in wood. Go throw a piece of fire. I've done this, like I've done this video. Go throw a piece of wood in a bomb calorimeter and you'll find out that it's about as calorically dense as a steak. That doesn't mean anything. And people are, oh, we're talking about food. No, there's no food definition in calorie. The only thing that's related to food is the use of a big calorie, because an actual calorie is a small unit of measurement. Okay. And a big calorie is 1,000 little
Small
calories.
calories.
Yeah, it's a kilocalorie. That's all it is. Right.
Mhm.
There's nothing that says, hey, this is something in my body. Uranium has a ton of calories. I'm not getting fat. I'm not getting fat off uranium. Right. So unfortunately, it's the best we have. But the problem is, I feel like we developed this in the 60s, right? When somebody threw a pound of fat in a bomb calorimeter, goes, oh my gosh, that's 3,500 calories. That's how much it takes to lose a pound of fat. And we're like, okay, that's good enough. And we've stopped. For the last 60 years, you're telling me nobody has been like, isn't there a better way to measure this? No, it's just become this universal thing that we're like, hey, that's good enough, right? Just tell people to burn less. And I think the problem is, and where people, where you run into these issues is, yeah, there's no other way to quantify it. I can't tell you to eat a pound of meat because depending on the fat level of that meat, it could be a huge variance, right?
Huge.
It could be 800 calories or it could be 1,600 calories.
That's right.
And so, I mean, yeah, it is the best, and it is something you have to do or have to use, but it completely negates this idea that it's our food. It's the food that we are eating that's messing everything up. And part of it is we were never meant to have access to this many carbohydrates. Again, I don't think carbohydrates are the devil. I don't think they're necessarily bad, but carbohydrates are the lighter fluid that you spray on the fire. They're not meant to be the log in the fire, right? Like we were never meant to consistently get all of our energy from carbs. And so when you continually inundate your body with this, you continually inundate yourself with these insulin spikes, and people are like, oh, well, protein spikes, insulin, and fat spikes insulin. And yeah, it does. But you also have to look at the graph, right? They both spike, and then fats and protein come down immediately. Fat barely does anything. Carbs spike and then have this long, drawn out elevation. You consistently put your body through that, something that your body was never meant to do, and you wonder why we have problems. Like it just is what it is. And then you take the fact that our carbohydrate sources are so much higher in fructose than they were before, right? They have so much less fiber. People are gonna be like, oh my gosh, fiber. Fiber's good when you're eating carbohydrates. Like they should be together. Take a look at natural sources of sugar outside of honey and like your milk, which doesn't have that many. Fiber and carbs are paired together. Pure sugar comes from sugarcane, which is encased in a very fibrous stalk, right? They're supposed to go together. And so you remove the fiber, you add this processed sugar, which is just pure sugar, with high levels of fructose, and you're going to get these metabolic issues. And you consistently bombard yourself with all of these spikes, and you don't have anything stable. Like nothing in our food supply is stable. There's no such thing as, yeah, I maintain, level insulin, level sugar. Like our body was not meant to do this. Like we're not supposed to be in this constant state of fight or flight. Like our body wants homeostasis. They wants to stay relatively even keel. And so you take all of this stuff and all of these issues that we have, and the fact that we're now measuring with something that in a perfect world would probably be okay. If we were in a vacuum, it would probably be okay. If we didn't have any of these metabolic issues, it'd probably be okay. But now we're trying to educate people with an outdated terminology that doesn't tell the whole story. And it's like, it's hard, right? And it's no wonder people go through all of this stuff and don't get results.
It's very hard. I mean, especially when the food environment is such that carbohydrates are the main, food out there. Whenever you go into a supermarket, the bulk of the supermarket is the stuff inside, not the stuff on the perimeter, the stuff that needs no refrigeration, the stuff that's all based in wheat and corn. and it is, I don't consider it real food. And, this is what people grow up on, and this is what their metabolisms have adapted to, have slowed down to accommodate. And our insulin levels are showing it, our glucose levels are showing it, our rates of diabetes are showing it. When you went back to do that standard American diet experiment, how did that feel for you? Like, we didn't discuss it much, but when you went from doing a carnivore diet for a while to back to standard American, did you feel like you had before you'd switched to meat based, or did you feel even worse?
Felt even worse. I felt terrible. And it illustrated, like, there was times where I felt high. Like, I would I would start my workout and I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, I feel amazing. I feel like I could run through a brick wall." And then after 30 minutes, I'd be like, "Yeah, it's gone." Huh. And I would go through these stages of, and I'm not somebody that has depression. I've never struggled with that, so I try to use this loosely to not, you know, be disingenuous to the people who do struggle with that. But I felt like I went through depressive waves where I would be on such a high, and then an hour, 2 hours later, I'd be low, and I'd like question what I was doing. I'm like, why am I doing this? Like, I don't feel that good. Like, this sucks. Like, what am I doing right now? And then I had really bad constipation in the beginning. I've never had constipation on carnivore, and I had to take laxatives because it was so bad. And I was like, man, what is happening right now? And so, and then I had, a really, really bad eczema flare up, something that took me like 6 months to resolve completely, like brutal to the point where, and that made the depressive stuff worse. I was angry. Like, this was like 10 days into it. And I was like, no, I'm going to do the full 21 days. But I was upset. And like, shortly after I did a before and after, when I started using tallow, because tallow was the only thing that it didn't fix it, right? But it kept my hands from being so dry that they would just crack and bleed. But I did like a before and after. My hands, it looked like I went through a wood chipper. Like, they were horrible. I had weeping eczema, which it literally, like, the backs of my hands like blistered, like these tiny little blisters, and then they would pop, and I would have edema that just oozed out of the back of my hands. I literally had to like walk around with like a tissue and like dab. And so, like, all of these things together, I'm like, okay, like, we're not supposed to do this. Like, and it reaffirmed to me that I think carbohydrates can be used well, but I think they're only should be used to the point of what you're going to use burn for energy, right? Like, and so you take a look at the fact that we move less than we ever have, right? We sit more, we drive our cars, we don't walk, we don't any of this stuff, and we are still inundating ourselves with this fuel source that the body does really one or two things with. It burns it or it stores it. And it burns it, and it burns it first because guess how many problems arise from having too much glucose in our systems,
A
right?
ton.
Like,
It's a problem.
so the body goes, hey, I can use this. This is good, but I need to make sure I don't have too much of this. So I'm going to use this one first, right? It's not that dissimilar to alcohol, right? Alcohol is the first thing your body's going to. Now, I'm not saying carbohydrates are poison, right? Like, the people like, that's totally different. Alcohol's no. Our body still understands what it needs to utilize first, right?
Hmm.
Is it something our body needs? Yes, we do need glucose, but our body also understands that we don't need very much of it. And if it doesn't have it, it can create its own. So it's just this inundation with fuel sources and not matching it up with activity and not using the fuel. And it just leads to these metabolic issues. And that's why, even though we have all these advances in science, we have alarming increases in obesity, alarming increases in diabetes, in metabolic conditions, in prescription drug, the drugs that we're prescribing, and even heart disease, right? Heart disease, though our death rate, this is also one, you try and Google heart disease, it'll always come down to death rate. They will always tell you death rate. But when you actually look at it, the incidence of heart disease is going up in line with our population growth. Like, heart disease isn't getting better. We're just getting better at people not dying from it right away. So it's like, all of these advances in technology, all these advances in medical, and we're getting worse. Like something's wrong, and it's our food. And anybody who denies that, that's why I have such a problem. Like you have these fit and healthy people. I could go on there and be like, eat your Wheaties, eat
Yeah,
your Pop Tarts. I can do it. You can do it too. Well, no. 88% of the population is metabolically unhealthy. 88% of the population eats that junk. And guess what? It's not helping them get any better.
right. And this is what I see in the comment section on your posts is, like you alluded to at the beginning, it's these fitness gurus, large men typically, lots of muscle mass in the gym consistently saying, dude, it does not matter what you eat. It's just about the calories. And, it's difficult to look inside them and see what their metabolic health is, see, if they're really destroying themselves from the inside. But when you utilize, like you said, when you're utilizing that much carbohydrate in the gym, sure. When you've got that large muscle mass to use as a glucose sink, sure, you can get away with some more carbohydrates. But that still doesn't address the problem of the glyphosate that's sprayed on the wheat or the food coloring that's added to the processed foods. So it's like, again, calorie is not a calorie. We are not meant to be eating these ultra processed, high carbohydrate, toxic foods. I mean, I'm with you when you say carnivore is king. I think that that's the best we can do is carnivore because it avoids glucose spikes. It avoids the toxins that are sprayed on most of the agricultural stuff, and it gets rid of most of the fiber issues that people have. And so it's like a win-win-win. I think it's great. And I appreciate that you're so open to doing these experiments, that you're open to having this conversation to discuss, sort of like the criticisms of your experiments. Because like you said, you could easily be one of these CICO bros because you could eat anything and you would sort of maintain, you're able to maintain your weight because of your metabolic health. Anyone who says like, oh, JT, you're not in great shape anyway, like they are blind, absolutely blind. I can't believe the level of delusion in your comment section sometimes. I'm like, I don't think they're seeing what I'm seeing. So, anyway, thank you so much for joining us. Again, thank you for taking the time. I appreciate your generosity in giving us, sort of explanation and the back and forth about that, calories in context, that they do matter, that your experiments are, and n equal 1, and everyone needs to sort of do their own n equals 1 to see where they should be for them. But yeah, carnivore is king for me. You're
Yeah,
sticking
and
with it. Yeah,
that's
I'm sticking with it.
so people also get in, not to drag this out, but people will get into this thing. Everybody likes to come in, we're omnivores. I'm like, okay, I never said we weren't. But I have literally never said we are not. I think this works the best because, as you alluded to, it gets rid of the processed food, right? It gets rid of the toxic chemicals that are sprayed on our food. You can talk about the dose makes the poison and how much we're not supposed to have Roundup weed killer in our food. I don't care how little. Okay. We also have this, we have our monocropping society has destroyed the nutrients in the ground. Guess where plants get their nutrients from? The sun and the ground, right? So you start depleting the soil of nutrients and you're going to have less nutrients in your plants. Like it's just the way it is. So you have that. You have the fact that most of what we eat, even the stuff that we grow, is not natural, right? It's all a man-made concoction. There are not very many naturally occurring vegetables. Everything we eat has been, created essentially. Kale's my favorite one. Kale's a superfood. Well, kale was actually designed, I believe it was in France, as a way to withstand harsh harvest seasons as basically a food of starvation, right? Like we need something that in case, everything goes three sheets to the wind, that something will grow and we can live off of, right? Like, so no, kale is not a superfood. Kale's a concoction to keep us alive. And then you have these fruits that we've progressively bred to be sweeter and have a much higher fructose content than they were before. And so you get all of these things. And I'm like, the easiest is just to avoid it, right? Like, yes, we've selectively bred animals and cows, but they're still pretty close. And yes, their diets are terrible for the most part, but they have this beautiful system in place that filters out 99.9% of that garbage, which is why we eat a lot of ruminants, because ruminants have this ability. They're literally nature's filtration system. And so it gives you the best chance of avoiding all of this stuff. And yeah, in a perfect world, we would all grow our own fruits and minimal vegetables. We would all eat them while they're in season. They would all be, in fertile ground without the spray, and everybody would be happy. Do I think that's the perfect world? Yes, I do.
Hmm.
Right? We wouldn't avoid carbs completely. We wouldn't avoid vegetables. We wouldn't avoid fiber. But when you just take the totality of where we are, I just think this is best. I think we were meant to be fat adapted for the majority of the time. I think it helps our metabolic health. I think it helps our cognitive. It just being like this, there's something to be said for it. And so, just inundated with all the stuff that we are, that's why I think this is best. Can people survive and thrive and all that other stuff? Yeah, absolutely. You can eat anything, right? We are very
Mhm.
flexible creatures. But I think
Scavengers.
everybody, yeah. And do I think everybody should do carnivore? No, not necessarily. But I think everybody should try it. What's the worst that's going to happen? 30 days. What are you going to do? Right? We've all been told heart disease. We don't get that for 20 years, right? Like, it doesn't matter how good you're doing. It's going to take 20 years. So 30 days is not going to hurt you. Do it and see how you feel, because most people feel a ton better. And if you feel a ton better and you are reversing all of these issues, I got rid of psoriasis. I got rid of my eczema. I got, my receding hairline stopped. Like, I have the same amount of hair that I did back when I was 26. People are like, you're bald. I'm like, I shaved my head. I live in Arizona. It was over 100 for 120 straight days. I shaved my head. Okay. Like, all of these things, like my inflammation went down, my digestive, all of these things. You cannot tell me that my body's positive response is now going to be like, oh, just kidding. This is going
Yeah,
to kill you. Whatever. I don't care. People should try it. And I
I
think they would
totally
be
agree.
amazed.
It's incredible. I mean, it really is. People still think it's so crazy. And after so many years and so many stories of people feeling so much better doing it, I say to people, like, how can you think it's crazy? You have to try it. I think everybody should try it too. But I love that you're open to, it's not for everybody. And, there is something to be said for the fact that, yeah, we Americans can go overseas, go to Italy, eat the pasta, and not feel like we want to die. There is literal poison being sprayed on our food here that is just not everywhere else. And so it does make the argument, at least for in America, that it's sort of the safest bet, at this point. Okay. So thank you so much for taking the time, spending it with us. Can you tell everybody where they can find out more about you, your cookbook, your podcast, your socials, all of that?
Yeah, so my website is theinnercarnivore.com. That's also the name of the podcast. I wrapped up season 1. I am in the works of getting season 2 going, but there are 41 episodes for anybody who wants to catch up on that. Carnivore JT across all social media. Twitter has an underscore, but luckily there's like no Carnivore JT. So literally, if you Google Carnivore JT, I pop up. Yeah, I'm active on all of them. I have. It's actually interesting. I have quite different. I don't want to call it a fan base, but like community on each different platform, which is kind of unique. I kind of expected that I would just get followers and then, they follow me from one, so they follow me from another. Like, I have so many select people who just follow me on Twitter and then just follow me on Instagram and then just follow me on YouTube. So, but I am on all of them, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, Threads, Twitter, all of them.
Awesome. And do you have any plans for any more experiments coming up? I need to brace myself.
I actually do. I am going to, and I'm gonna change this one a little bit. My plan is to find 5 to 10 of the most physically based predictors of longevity and see how close I can get to those. And so when I say physically based, VO2 max, is a huge one. That's a great predictor of longevity. There's actually a large study on grip strength, like grip strength as a predictor of
Mhm.
longevity. So my goal is to find as many of those as I can, and then be like, okay, so I have hit all of these, right? According to these, I'm going to live forever. Are you really telling me that these studies, which are super weak in their data about my consumption of red meat, is going to offset all of these?
I
So
love
it's
it.
it's it's less like how am I going to respond, and more like can I hit all of these metrics to indicate on the surface that I'm going to live for a very, very long time, but my meat consumption is what
I love it.
that's my my idea for the next one.
They're always great. You've always got me on the edge of my seat. Like, what is happening here? What is he doing? Like, this cannot be real. So I'm going to be keeping up with that. Thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate your time.
I appreciate you having me.
All right, you take care. Bye bye.